Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, on this show, we often talk about the negative sides of AI and offer a few warnings about what not to do with this technology and how humans often unwittingly enter their bias into algorithms. But today, I want to explore a more positive side with Katica Roy, and she's the gender economist and CEO of a company called Pipeline, which is a technology platform that uses artificial intelligence to weed out unconscious bias and help companies create gender equity in the workplace. And it does this by analysing employee hiring, pay, performance, potential, promotional data, and so much more. And I think it's such an important topic, so buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Denver, Colorado, where we can explore this topic together. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Katica Roy. I am a gender economist and the CEO and founder of Pipeline. What I do is a couple of things. One is look at the economy through the lens of gender or intersectional gender equity, gender plus race and ethnicity and age. And my company actually uses artificial intelligence and cloud computing to make equity a reality in enterprise organizations.
And there's so many reasons I was excited to get you on the podcast today. But before we talk about that, I'd love to take you back in time a moment and understand more about where your passion for tech came from, or the moment that put you on the path that you're on today, and how the worlds of technology and equity, inclusion, etc., how they all collided for you. Or ultimately, what's your origin story?
So I'll talk a little bit about my family history, but for me, tech, probably my love for tech itself started with math. Yeah. Math was my favorite subject from the time I was in grade school all the way through high school and beyond. I loved algebra. I loved figuring out problems. I loved formulas. I loved all of that. I am an engineer by training, a software engineer by training. My love for equity is a little bit different, but maybe just as connected. So I am the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. My mom was actually British. She was born on Guernsey, so one of the Channel Isles, in 1939, the year that World War II began. And in 1940, when Prime Minister Churchill doubted his ability to defend the Channel Isles, he actually evacuated them. And my mom was one of the children that was evacuated to mainland England. And she was separated from her mother and 4 children. She was 18 months old, placed into an orphanage, or what was known then as a children's home, and adopted a year later. And she immigrated to the United States for equality and opportunity. And she would meet my dad there. My father was a refugee. I'll tell this story quickly, but it has a lot to do with why I ended up founding Pipeline. He escaped after the fall of the 1956 revolution in Hungary. He escaped not only himself, but also with my 3 oldest sisters, who were 3, 7, and 8 at the time. And with the help of Hungarian freedom fighters, they walked across a minefield, crossed the border into Austria, and arrived to a refugee camp. And less than 2 months into their stay in the refugee camp, President Eisenhower sent Air Force One to bring 21 Hungarian refugees to the United States on Christmas Day, 1956, and they were on that plane. And so that has a lot to do with why I founded Pipeline, because I sit here with you today and have the opportunity to found a company because someone in a position of power said, not on my watch, this will not happen. These people matter. And that's why I founded Pipeline, which was to really ensure that the folks coming after me, men and women, had more opportunity than what I had.
Wow, what an incredible and powerful story there. And that's one of the reasons I asked that question. It's all very well talking about a company and the technology that they use and the problems that they solve, but it's stories like that that are right at the heart of what you're doing. And that's what makes this podcast what it is. And of course, it would be that path that led you to Pipeline, which is a technology platform that uses artificial intelligence to weed out unconscious bias. But just to set the scene, can you expand on the scale of the problem we're talking about here and maybe a few typical examples of unconscious bias in the workplace?
Sure. So let me start with a couple of things. One is that Pipeline actually started with research.
Yeah.
So we did a research study across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in intersectional gender equity, so as I mentioned before, gender plus race and ethnicity and age, there's a 1 to 2% increase in revenue. And so it's not only the right thing to do, it's actually a massive economic opportunity. What we saw in the marketplace is that 96% of CEOs put equity in their top priorities. Unfortunately, only 22% of employees regularly see that shared and measured. So you have this 74-point gap between what CEOs and companies say is important, so their employer branding, and the actual employee experience. That's the gap that Pipeline closes. More broadly, in the United States, in the United States, equity is a $3.1 trillion opportunity, and globally, it's $12 trillion. So this is really not only about the right thing to do, it's a massive economic opportunity. To drive that down to what that actually looks like in companies, what we've found is that there are 3 key decisions that companies make across their people each year, which is performance, potential, and pay. So for the average Fortune 500 company that has 60,000 employees, that's 180,000 opportunities to move toward equity each and every year. That's what Pipeline makes possible. And I can talk a little bit more about how we actually make that possible as well.
I'd love to hear more about how you're solving this huge set of problems with technology and how you did this, because it's a big problem to go after, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is a big problem, but where there are big problems, there are also big opportunities.
Yes.
There are 2 pieces really that we aim to solve. One obviously is through our tech. One is more through my thought leadership, and then driving that down to Pipeline. But the first is the narrative around equity, and there are 2 issues. There's more than 2 issues, but 2 key issues with the narrative around equity. One is that we often think that gender equity is a synonym for women's rights, and it's not. Women are half the conversation, men are the other half. And not just because men hold the majority of all leadership positions in organizations, but also because gender inequity impacts them too. We just don't talk about it. So that's one. The second is that we often look at equity as the right thing to do rather than a massive economic opportunity. One of the key responsibilities of CEOs is to maximize shareholder value. And if you look at that through the lens of equity, then equity becomes a really important lever for CEOs to pull to maximize shareholder value. So that's the other piece. So the first part is new narratives. Yeah. And from new narratives come new solutions. Because if we continue to look at this as the right thing to do, as only the right thing to do, let me clarify that, then we get solutions that are things like checkbox diversity. And one example of that is implicit bias training, which is really well intended, but doesn't work. So companies on average spend $8 billion a year on unconscious bias training. And what the research shows is that either it doesn't make a difference at all, or it can actually make inclusion worse, equity worse. And the reason is that it actually reinforces stereotypes. So if you're looking, if companies are looking at a better way to invest that $8 billion, that capital, using artificial intelligence and cloud computing, such as Pipeline, is a really important way to reinvest that capital.
And of course, outside of this space, throughout history, we've all seen what happens with software applications. If you put garbage in, you get garbage out. So how much of a challenge is it ensuring that nobody feels or nobody actually feeds unconscious bias into their AI? Because again, that's a big responsibility, isn't it?
It is. There are two pieces of this. The first is the actual data. So if you understand the bias that the data holds, then you can actually correct for that. That's one. The second is who is actually developing the algorithms. And one of the things that we know is that women make up only 25% of AI specialists. So we've got about a 25 point gap between that and the representation that they should have. So ensuring that teams that are actually developing the algorithms are actually diverse and inclusive is another really key point to ensuring that AI is not biased.
And you don't have to mention any names here, but do you have any, I don't know, examples of how technology or your technology has made a big impact in a business to help anyone listening envision a before and after picture of how your technology is making such a big difference?
Yeah. So pipeline is augmented decision making. So much like you would use Google Maps or Waze to get from point A to point B, we do the very same thing, but for companies' people decisions. So practically what that looks like is that we intercept HR decisions. So Workday obviously is an investor in Pipeline, and we're also partners. So there are 5 key decisions that companies make across their talent each year, which is internal hiring, pay, performance, potential, and promotion. When managers go to make those decisions, so for instance, they write a performance review and save it as a draft, or they submit a pay proposal, or they post a job requisition, that actually sends a trigger to the Pipeline platform that they need a recommendation. We take those decisions and run them through our algorithms before those decisions are made. And if we find any inequity, we make recommendations. So what we have found is that on average, our customers actually improve equity by 67% in the first 3 months on the platform. In the hiring module, what we found is that for 86% of all job requisitions, we find 5 or more qualified internal candidates that can fill those roles. There's a fair amount of latent talent, so talent with skills that aren't being used in organizations. We surface that and then provide an equity lens on that. We've also found that about 1/3 of all performance reviews contain bias, and 4% of the time that leads to women receiving lower performance ratings. And while that 4% doesn't sound like a lot, modeled out, what it actually means is that it takes women twice as long to be promoted into the same role. So those are all things that we fix, and we fix them at scale.
Wow, that's incredible. And I would imagine there'd be a lot of business leaders listening to our conversation today thinking, this is exactly what we should be doing. And they enter the office and there'll be a nervous IT director there saying, well, what is it? What's the technology? How does it work? And all those kind of techie questions. So how easy is it for a business to get up and running with this?
It's actually not that hard. If customers are Workday customers, we can have it live in it's a 1 business day turnaround from a technical perspective. And if they're non-Workday customers, so they have other cloud-based HR platforms like SuccessFactors or Oracle HCM, it takes 5 business days. So it's a pretty quick turn to actually have the system itself live.
And what kind of steps should companies be taking, would you say, to change inequitable systems in the workplace, including embedding equity into the employee life cycle, creating workplace cultures and facilitating authenticity without retaliation? Where should they begin on this journey?
It's interesting that you asked that question. There are 2 pieces to that. The first is that it's important that we understand that our systems are inequitable by default, right? I have been leading teams and people for a very long time, obviously very committed to equity. But in traditional organizations, I had to choose to be equitable. That's a very different decision-making model than what pipeline when companies have pipeline. So when companies have pipeline, because all of those people decisions are actually running through our system, we change the system from inequitable by default to equitable by design. And what that means is, as a manager, if all of my decisions are running through the pipeline platform and I receive a recommendation, for instance, to change somebody's pay or to remove bias from their performance review and ensure that their ratings are equitable, if I choose to reject that recommendation, I may have a very good reason for doing that. However, the decision-making model then is I may be choosing to be inequitable. That's a very different decision-making model than actually choosing to be equitable. And that's why we see that on average, our customers increase equity by 67% in the first 3 months on the platform. So I think for companies, particularly enterprise companies, so those with 10,000 employees or more, it's really important to understand that we can catapult our time toward equity and really close that 74-point gap between what companies and CEOs say is important in terms of equity and the actual employee experience.
And I'm curious, since you launched Pipeline, what kind of feedback have you had? And have you noticed a real change in the industry and an appetite for change? Are these the kind of things that you're seeing now?
For sure. I mean, we've seen increases in companies committing to equity. We've seen the conversation become central. Obviously, COVID-19 accelerated that substantially. With the economic fallout, obviously from an economic perspective in the United States, we still have 513,000 women missing from the labor force as of the last jobs report. And that's happening at a time when we have almost 2 jobs open for every person looking for a job. One of the ways that economists, such as myself, talk about a soft landing in the current economic environment is to increase labor supply. And one of the key ways that we can increase labor supply is to ensure gender equity in the labor force. And one of the ways to ensure gender equity in the labor force is to actually ensure equity within your company. Not just, can I get this job, but can I actually build a career? Well, I have equity of opportunity in this company. And Pipeline is really the platform to ensure that happens.
Fantastic. And as we look towards the future, what makes you hopeful or even excited about the future and where we're heading?
I think what makes me excited about the future is that we see more and more companies embracing solutions like Pipeline, and specifically Pipeline. So that is really positive, and that makes me excited about the future. I think we're beginning also to see more broadly in the economic conversation. So when we see key economic releases such as the jobs report or the weekly jobless claims, we're beginning to see more conversations around looking at that data through the lens of intersectional gender equity. I think that's really important, and really looking also at the economic opportunity of equity, not just equity as the right thing to do.
Well, we started the podcast today talking about your origin story and what put you on this path. And as we finish, I just want to put a bit of positivity out there in the universe, because I think none of us are able to achieve success without a little help along the way. And we always focus on the success and everyone stood at the summit, but not the climb and how we got here. So is there a particular person that you're grateful towards who helped you get you where you are that we can just give a nice thank you and a nod to?
There are 2, if you'll allow me.
Of course.
I'm an entrepreneur, so I don't always play by the rules. The first one is my 3rd grade math teacher, Mr. Patterson. He had a huge impact on my life. He really recognized my love for math and my aptitude for it, and encouraged it. And I, am forever grateful for him. So Mr. Patterson at Vichy, he's probably long retired now, but Vichy Elementary School in Napa, California. And then the second person, her name is Patty Shank. She was one of my professors in my first master's degree, which was essentially cognitive science and computer science. So how you architect technical systems to change people's behavior. And she recognized in me my ability for thought leadership and to really put things together in new and novel ways, and pushed me to publish research that I had done during grad school, and really elevated my brand both during grad school, but after I graduated, using her brand. And I'm forever grateful to her, because I did not see that in myself, and she saw it in me. And she definitely is an example of somebody who reached a hand back and helped me.
Wow, you began the podcast on an incredibly powerful note, and you're leaving us on one too. But before I let you go, for anyone listening just wanting to find out more information about anything we talked about today, or even carry on this conversation and contact your team, etc., what's the best starting point for Everything Pipeline?
Yeah, so there's two places. One is Pipeline Equity with 2es.com. You can find us there. You can also find us across social, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And then the other place that folks can go is my website, which is Katica, KATICAROY.com.
Well, I love chatting with you today about how you're using technology and artificial intelligence to weed out unconscious bias and help companies create gender equality in the workplace, but also for sharing your very powerful story as well. And just more than anything, just a big thank you for taking the time to sit down with me and share that with me. But I wish you the best of luck for the future. I'd love to stay in touch with you and see how this journey carries on, and we'll get you back on next year. But thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So a big thank you to today's guest for discussing the steps companies can take to change inequitable systems in the workplace, including embedding equity into the employee life cycle, creating workplace cultures that facilitate authenticity, all without retaliation, and for delivering a much-needed positive AI story to restore the balance in the universe. But obviously you've heard from me today, you've heard from today's guest, but I now want to put the microphone over to you and hear your side of this story. It's a topic that impacts every single business out there, and I'd love to hear more about how you're dealing with it and how you're leveraging technology. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram @NeilCHughes, and my website, if you'd like to work with me, is techblogwriter.co.uk. But that's it for today's episode. So a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.